when I was growing up, I've shared before how math was always a struggle for me. It was always really hard for me to get it growing up. And math, like all subjects in school, starts at a very basic level, but then begins to advance as you go on and move. And it's been a while, but if memory serves, there was a point in school where the teacher would give you a math problem, then you just scribble in an answer. If you got it right, you got it right. If you got it wrong, you got it wrong, and you just move on. But over time, math began to advance. Where now just giving it an answer isn't enough. You have to show your work of how you got there. So now you couldn't just scribble in an answer, hope for the best, and be able to move on. Even if it was multiple choice and you got the answer right, or even if it wasn't multiple choice and by some miracle you got the answer right, it wouldn't be enough because now you needed to show your work. Y'all, this was a problem for me. Because even if I stumbled across the right answer and got it right, even if I kind of knew how to get there and got it right, it wasn't enough because now I needed to show my work on how I got there. Initially, this was really frustrating for me. So I'm thinking, why do I have to do all these extra steps? Why is this extra work required if I happen to get it right? But the reason that teachers want you to show your work is to make sure that you understand. Understanding was better than stumbling across the right answer. And showing your work was the measurement of your understanding. It's really a quite wise principle. And the interesting thing about this principle in mathematics is that there is a very similar one that is also present in our faith. Where today, part of the wisdom that James is imparting to us is that when it comes to the way in which we live out our faith, when it comes to the way in which we interact with other people, that our faith or our works, our deeds, are an essential part of displaying the faith that we have in Jesus. What good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone? Short verse, read it one more time. It says this. What good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but don't show it with your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone? So right out the gate, James is getting real. And he's asking us, what good is it? What good does it do to say you have faith? What good does it do to say you have this belief, this trust in God, but have no actions to support that belief? What good is it to say we have faith in God, but also have these spaces in our life in which that would not be evidence? He says, can that kind of faith really save anyone? That's an intense thing to say. And in some ways, we might already relate to that challenge of does my talk reflect my walk? But our temptation might be to look at this passage and say, well, that doesn't really apply to me. It's not really an issue that I face. I don't really relate to that. But he continues in verse 15, and this is what he says. He says, suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say goodbye and have a good day and stay warm and eat well, but then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do? So he gives us this hypothetical interaction, and it's a pretty warm interaction between ourselves and a person in need. And he says that we say, hey, dear brother and sister, you have a great day. You have a great day, you stay warm, you eat well. I speak warmth and good food over you, right? It's a great thing to say. You might even feel a little spiritual being able to say it. But then he adds, if there are no actions that accompany your words, then what good are your words? If we have faith and we make these proclamations of faith, but they aren't spurring us to action. If we have faith and we have these proclamations of faith, but it isn't producing any good works or any good deeds in our lives, he asks, how impactful is your faith really? Does your faith matter if it doesn't spur you to live differently? It's intense. James is so intent on communicating the reality of this. He goes on to say this in verse 17. He says, so you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. Faith by itself is not enough. Unless it produces good deeds, unless it is accompanied by actions and good things, it is not enough on its own. Just faith is described as dead and useless. It's a controversial text, and it's kind of like in your face, and it confronts you, and it challenges you, and it is like does not let you break from its gaze. It's a very controversial text. It's always been, the book of James has always been controversial. In fact, Martin Luther, a famous theologian, said that he had serious issues with the book of James. He says that he called the book of James an epistle of straw. Other sources say he had a big issue with this exact text. And a lot of people do as well. Part of the reason so many people have issues with this text is it seems to butt up against and contrast with something else the Apostle Paul says in Ephesians 2. Ephesians 2, verses 8 through 9 says this. It says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." So when people have these two passages, one saying that faith without works is dead, and you didn't earn your faith, it is a gift from God, it seems like these two things contradict one another, and they butt up against one another. But really, if we take a look, these two truths, they don't isolate each other, they support each other. When we bring these two things together, this is the truth that we get. It's not about faith or works. It's about a faith that works. It's not about you have to pick a side. You got to be one or the other. But it's about how these two things brought together produce something good. So we can't earn our salvation. That is from the grace of Jesus. But it is because of the grace of Jesus that we are to live in a way we are moved to action and to producing good deeds because of what God has done. And if we're not living in a way that has produced good actions, if we're not living in a way that has produced good deeds, James says our faith in Jesus may not be worth very much at all. Does this bother anybody else? Like, it feels very like, I'm going to say this and you're going to listen. It cuts deep. It confronts you internally. And what this does is it attacks this American concept that we've created that your faith is between you and Jesus. You leave that to you and Jesus. That's not something that you share with other people. It's not something that you talk about. You say your prayer of faith, and then you kind of hide in a corner and wait for eternity. That's kind of the concept of what we're supposed to do with Jesus. But James says that's not true at all. He says your faith is meant to move you to action and good deeds. Your faith is supposed to move you to serve. It's supposed to move you to love. It's supposed to move you to share. And if it doesn't do any of those things, what kind of faith do you have? In other words, he's saying, is your faith worth anything if it does not change you? Is your faith worth anything if it does not affect the way that you live? Is it worth anything if it does not affect the way that you talk to people when you're upset? Is it worth anything if it does not affect the way that you care for those in need? Is your faith worth anything if it does not move you to move? Now again, this passage gets up in your face and challenges you. And we may not like that. James knows we're going to have issues with this text because we love to have faith in Jesus, but doing things with it is another challenge. So he gives us this argument in verse 18. And this is what he says. He says, now someone may argue, hey, some people have faith, others have good deeds. But I say, how can you show me your faith if you don't have good deeds? I will show you my faith by my good deeds. So I love how real this is because we have a habit of making excuses for either things that we don't want to do or things that we don't want to accept, right? So he's saying, some might say, hey, James, bro, everybody's different. Some people have great amount of faith and that is their gift and that's good. Some people are doers. They don't really do things out of faith. They just kind of do it. It's okay, James. We're all part of the body of Christ. Everybody's different. It's all good. It sounds sensical, right? Like it makes sense. But James is saying it's not about either or. It's not about faith or works. It's about a faith that works. Faith and works are supposed to be brought together to display the change Jesus makes in our lives. And they're not meant to be separated as an excuse to not live missionally as followers of Jesus. So James says, how can you show me faith without works? I'll show you faith by my works. I'll show you my faith by what I do. I'll show you my faith by what I say. I'll show you my faith by how I serve. I'll show you my faith by how I love. I'll show you my faith by how I talk, and by how I listen, and by how I spend my time. Because faith and our works come together as the natural outpouring of what Jesus does in our lives. It's because of the way Jesus changes us that it's meant to produce a change in the way that we live. He goes on to say this in verse 19. He says, "You say you have faith, for you believe that there is one God." Good for you. Even the demons believe this, and they tremble in terror. How foolish. Can't you see that faith without works is useless? Again, it's another big teaching. It's a very controversial teaching. James is saying believing is not enough. Believing in God is not enough. He says, you believe in God? Well, that's great. Even the demons believe in God. They believe that He is the Lord, that the Lord is one. But their works reveal that they aren't following Him. Their works reveal that they are not being changed by Him. Their works are revealing that they are not living as if Jesus has done anything to the way they live their lives. And what we see is this: believing in God is the first step. So we try to say during most services that Romans 10:9, if you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart Jesus is Lord, you will be saved. That's true. That's the first step, but it doesn't end there. It continues with continuing to walk with God in a way that our lives are different because of our walk with God. There's a statistic. Why is that hard to say? There was a fact. In 2021, there's a statistic released that said 63% of Americans consider themselves Christians. 63%, yeah, I believe in God. Yeah, God and I are good. We're fine. But Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Not everyone who just gives me lip service and says, yeah, I believe in God, will enter the kingdom of heaven. We are saved by grace through faith, yes, but it is the grace of God, the impact of this relationship that is meant to be made clear in the way that we live. James brings our verses to a close and solidifies this need for good works in verse 21. And he says this. He says, "Don't you remember that our ancestor Abraham was shown to be right with God by his actions when he offered his son Isaac, on the altar? You see, his faith and his actions worked together. His actions made his faith complete. And so it happened just as the scriptures say, Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteousness because of his faith. He's even called the friend of God. So you see, we are shown to be right with God by what we do, not by faith alone." This audience that James is writing to was primarily Jewish in background. So they really would have understood the Old Testament example that he's presenting here. Abraham was known as the father of faith. You can read his story in Genesis 22. Short version of a long story is this. God goes to Abraham and says, Abraham, I'm going to give you a son. Not only am I going to give you a son, but your son is going to be the conduit of this nation of Israel. He says, I'm going to do this through your son. The problem was, Abraham and Sarah, his wife, were very old. They were even older by the time God finally delivered on that promise. Some years later, God meets Abraham and says, Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your son. A few issues with this. One is that this was Abraham's boy. That this was his son. Why would you ask me to sacrifice my son? Two, God does not enjoy human sacrifices. He detests that. So why are you asking me to make the sacrifice? I know you don't like this. Three, Isaac was supposed to be the one through whom God would deliver his promise. So nothing about this makes any sense at all. But nonetheless, even though he is confused, Abraham believes that what God is leading him to is better than what he has for himself. And what we see is this: even in extreme situations, God is counting it as righteous because his faith moved him to move. The faith of, I believe God is going to do this great thing, was not enough. But it was when his faith met an action that he was considered righteous. James continues in verse 25 with another example, and he says this. He says, Rahab the prostitute is another example. She was shown to be right with God by her actions when she hid those messengers and sent them safely away by a different road. Just as the body is dead without breath, so also faith is dead without good works. Another Old Testament example where the Israelites were about to enter into the promised land that God was giving to them. But before they entered, they had to go get it. It wasn't just, hey, here's a promised land. You have to go do something. So they went to go get it. They snuck into the land, scoping everything out, and they were being tracked. And they meet this prostitute Gentile. Her name was Rahab. She would have been seen as their enemy and also a person who traditionally would not be following God. But Rahab had this faith that God was worth following. So she betrayed her nation and hid these spies and led them on a different route when those pursuing them had left. And God responded to her faith in action by saving her and her entire family. Rahab, the prostitute, was moved to action and good deeds because of her faith. And the significance between these two things are so important that in the same passage, the father of faith, Abraham, and a Gentile prostitute, Rahab, are mentioned together in the same passage, praised the same way, because their faith moved them to action instead of having a faith that didn't move them at all. It's a powerful teaching. The wisdom that James is imparting to us in this verse is just as much as we are to be believing Christians, we are also to be doing Christians. Just as much as we are to be believing Christians, we are also to be doing Christians. Having a faith and a belief in God is good, but if this faith and belief in God does not move us to move, how impactful is it? Having a faith and belief in God is good, but it is the faith and belief in God that must move us to produce good deeds and good actions. And if our faith does not move us to live differently, if our faith does not move us to live differently, it may very well be dead. As we begin to wrap up, there's this quote by a commentator that summarizes this passage, I think, in a way that's really good, this passage. It says this: the warning is one that the church constantly needs to hear. Too often we have been content to offer mere words when God may be calling us to action. Words, sermons, prayers, confessions of faith, wise advice, encouragement are indispensable to true Christianity, but they have shown real meaning, James reminds us, when people can see the actions that correspond with those words. Our works is the platform in which our faith is able to be displayed. It's a sign that our faith is active and it's valuable and it matters. And it really will change you if you allow it. It's the sign that Jesus changes us and he changes the way we live and changes the way that we interact with and serve others. And in this we are reminded not to develop this complacent or this lazy or this dead faith, but to continue to develop a faith that allows the work of Jesus to be shown in the work that we do. And it's when we do this, we no longer live in the tension of faith or works, but develop a faith that works and shows that Jesus makes a change in our lives and changes the way that we live.